Right, good morning or good afternoon, Year 12. This is Wednesday, the 1st of April psychology lesson, where we're going to be thinking about something called institutionalisation, and it builds on what we've already done around Bowlby and the impact of not having secure attachment when you're an infant. But before we do that, your retrieval task today is just all around letters, in the sense that we have a lot of acronyms in psychology to help us remember all of the different content, and generally that works well, but I just want you to retrieve what you can. So what do the letters of door frame stand for? What's the UCS and the CR in Pavlov's dog's experiment? And what do the letters in Smacky each represent? So just grab a piece of paper or post-it note and retrieve as much as you can. Give yourself no more than 5 minutes. Don't look at your notes, and then we'll review that together. Okay, so hopefully you had a good go at that and you've got that in front of you. We're going to be using door frame today, and remember that's our evaluation toolkit. So our D was deterministic, our O was other evidence, which can be supporting evidence or contradictory evidence, and that's important when we're evaluating. Our other O is overemphasis. Does it overemphasize the importance of nature or nurture, or is it somewhere in between? Is it reductionist? Does it account for free will? Remember that overlaps with the determinism. What are the real life implications or applications of this theory or this piece of research? Was it using animals, and was that appropriate? What methodology or research method did it use, and was it ethical? And some of those are going to be particularly helpful for us today when we're looking at this piece of research. The UCS, the unconditioned stimulus in Pavlov's dogs, was of course the food, and the conditioned response was salivation at the sound of the bell. Really important that you put at the sound of the bell for the conditioned response, because salivation on its own was the unconditioned response. Okay, and then Smacky for our Bowlby's evolutionary theory of why attachments form. We have our social releases, monotrophy, adaptation or adaptation, critical period, and the internal working model. Okay, so we'll be building on aspects of Bowlby's theory, and we'll be building on our door frame evaluation a bit later on in today's lesson. So what we're going to be looking at, as I mentioned before, is institutionalisation. Now, an institution could be a hospital, it could be a prison, it could even be a school. But in this context, we're talking about specific types of institutions, and they are orphanages or children's homes. More specifically, orphanages in the piece of research we're going to look at. Now, in this country now, currently, thankfully, we don't have orphanages. We have a social care system that allows children to be fostered or adopted. We do have children's homes, but we're going to be focusing on some research around orphanages which were wide scale in Romania during the late 80s and early 90s. And so we're going to be thinking about this term institutionalisation, which is really asking that question of what effect did it have on those children when they spent long periods of time in what were very poor quality, badly resourced orphanages during that time. And we're going to be looking at a couple of key pieces of research which you've got on there. The ERA study, that just stands for the English and Romanian Adoptees Study, and we'll build on that. That was by somebody called Rutter. The Bucharest Early Intervention Project. And what all of these pieces of research do is they try to look at what effects it had. These children that were in these institutions, in these orphanages, for the first 6 months, or in some cases up to 2 years of their life, in bad conditions, often malnourished. What did it do for their physical development, their cognitive development, and their social development? Were they able to go on and form attachments? So this is why I say it's very much linked to Bowlby and his internal working model and this idea of the critical period. But this is where I want us to think about an important distinction, because Bowlby talked about those first 30 months as being the critical period. And we saw this in yesterday's lesson, that when we're thinking about maternal deprivation, if you don't have that attachment with your mother in the critical period, then it has negative consequences later on. And Bowlby would stand true to that. But there are some other studies and pieces of research out there that maybe suggest, rather than a critical period where it's absolutely critical that the attachment forms, we should view it more as a sensitive period. And that is that, yes, ideally we would want an attachment to form in that time frame, and if it doesn't, there are consequences, but that those consequences can be reversed. So there's a couple of studies that we're going to be thinking about. Rutter is the main one we're focusing on today, which is institutionalisation, but also Kolocheva looked at a case study of 2 young boys who were really badly abused, and actually they were locked in a cupboard and they were really neglected and socially isolated for the first 7 years of their life. But when they were adopted out of that into a caring home and given lots of emotional support, they basically caught up with their peers. Their IQ caught up with what the children their age would have been. They were able to go on to develop friendships and relationships. So Rutter and Kolocheva would suggest, actually, yes, it leads to negative consequences, but they can be reversed. There is reference to that Kolocheva study in the textbook, the page reference that I gave you yesterday when we were looking at this idea of maternal deprivation. So you can have a little read about that further. So these Romanian orphanages then, the late 80s, the early 90s, the conditions were really, really poor. And I've just given a couple of images here, photographs, to give you a little bit of context to it. So as you can see, a lot of the children would have been severely malnourished, so they weren't being given the nutrition they needed, and the conditions were very, very cramped, and the children wouldn't have been out of the sort of cots or the beds hardly at all, so they wouldn't have been developing their muscles and moving about. For the children that were old enough to walk, they had very little opportunity to do that, so their muscles would have become very, very weak. So physically, they were being deprived, but they were also being deprived emotionally and being deprived of attachments, because these children were in these orphanages often from as young as a few days old, and there was never a consistent carer looking after them. Some of the children would have had up to 50 different carers, a different person every day, so they never had that opportunity to form the attachment. There is a video clip here, and when you open up the PowerPoint, if you literally just click on the image, it will take you to a video clip, and it just gives you, although it's from an American news program, it just gives you a little bit of context about what these Romanian orphanages were like and why they existed. So just a little bit of historical context here. Basically, the country was under communist rule, and they'd banned things like abortion and contraception and required families to have 5 children. But this was at a time of severe food shortage and energy shortages, so of course families couldn't cope, so children were literally just being abandoned, and the only way the country could cope with it was to set up these large state-run, under-resourced, horrid environment orphanages. And so you had thousands and thousands of children, newborn children, which were abandoned and then picked up and taken into these orphanages. And of course the world kind of watched on. Many countries, including Britain, had campaigns to adopt many of these children out of the situation, but psychologists and health experts and child development experts were keen to know, what impact was this start in life going to have? And when we talk about the impact and the effect of institutionalisation, we generally look at it in 3 or 4 ways. We look at the emotional, social development. How's it going to affect their ability to form attachments, form friendships, relationships? How's it going to affect their intellectual or their cognitive development? Is their IQ ever going to catch up? And their physical development as well. If they're malnourished, if they've not had an opportunity to use their muscles, if they've become very, very weak, how's that going to affect them? And a lot of these studies are really interested in that, not just in the short term, but in the long term. So we call them longitudinal studies, and they want to know whether when these children were adopted out of the situation, they were brought to Britain, they were adopted into loving, caring families, could some of those negative effects be reversed? And Rutter, who's our main person that we look at here, suggested that they can, and that's why he would have used the term a sensitive period rather than a critical period. One of the key terms that you're going to come across is this idea of disinhibited attachment. So what Rutter found was that the longer the children stayed in the institution, if they were there for more than 6 months before they were adopted out of it, they showed disinhibited attachment. Now this involves attention-seeking behaviours, it involves an over-familiarity with adults you don't know. It basically, if you're disinhibited, you've lost your inhibitions. So all those inhibitions that we normally have when we meet someone for the first time, when we think, well, I don't know you, I'm kind of going to have my guard up a bit here. A child who has disinhibited attachment doesn't show any of that. And Rutter thought that actually we could explain this by the fact that these children had grown up the first 6 months or more of their life in an environment where they might have up to 50 carers. They didn't have 1 or 2 key people to form an attachment with, so they adapted to that environment, and they would adapt to anybody who looked as though they to anybody who looked as though they might be able to look after you and protect you. And that's what we see in these children. And it is important to note that it was in the children who spent longest in the institution before they were adopted that we see that worse. Now in the textbook, I'm going to give you the textbook reference here. We're looking at page 89-90, and it details these Romanian orphan studies. Now I've done some more detailed notes with some of the key vocabulary highlighted and some sort of annotations that I've attached on Sims engagement. So I would make sure you have that alongside the online textbook when you are reading a bit further into the Rutter study, which was the main one, but there is also a couple of other additional ones there as well. And you'll see I've highlighted or circled here that we need to think about the evaluation of that as well. So when you've had a good read through the study using the textbook and the notes that I've sent you, I'd like you to use door frame to think about evaluating it. So with Rutter's study in mind, Rutter in particular, although you may draw upon other evidence for our O there, I'd like you to focus just on the yellow bits, the highlighted bits, because we know with door frame some elements are more relevant than others sometimes. And I'd like you to have a go at writing yourself out a door frame. So focusing on what other evidence is there that either supports what Rutter had to say with his institution study or contradicted it. In what way is it reductionist? What real life applications have there been? How has this made a difference? Thinking possibly about the conditions within care homes, children's homes. What methodology did Rutter use to investigate this? We know it was a longitudinal study, but let's have a bit more about that. And how ethical was it? Now I'm going to review this and provide the answers in Friday's lesson, next lesson, but I want you to have a good go first. And I'm not expecting you to do it off the top of your head. Use that section in the textbook, use the notes, and really think about how useful is Rutter's study for our understanding on the effects of institutionalisation. Once you've done that, it would be appropriate to go back over this lesson, create yourself a couple of flashcards, have a look in your packs for your retrieval questions, have a go at a couple of retrieval questions that relate to this, and then we'll build on it and conclude in Friday's lesson. Okay, thanks Year 12.